Okay, now we've made our figure and we have our screen where we can select if it's player versus player or player versus computer. So now we're moving on to the actual gameplay. And as I said, this is the part that I like the most about this actual GUI that I'm creating. So let's get started on that. Now, if you remember from the last video, we have this start out where we have to pick player versus player or player versus computer, whichever one we pick, then we have to fill out our information and then we can go ahead and start the game. Starting the game just right now pulls up this blank figure because that's all we've done. So let's go in and actually start putting the game board on the figure. So I'm into my main code now. And as I said, I do know I'm going to address that at some point, but I already put that in another script file just to remind myself. So I'm going to get rid of it. The first thing I want to put on there is going to be that tic-tac-toe board. So I want to put on here the X's and O's part. So where you would put that on the grid. So remember from the last video, when I do a button, I'm just doing the UI control and I want to pick my style as push button. So also I like my units normalized because I don't want to have to think about how many pixels are on the screen and how to read that every time and then changing it. I just want it to always be based on a scaled position of where it is. So it's going to be 50%, 60%, 25%, how far into the screen, and then how big of the screen do I want it to be. And all the other ones, I've just been coding, hard coding it in. And as I said, for this one, I don't want to go this hard coding route. So instead of putting in 4 numbers, I'm going to be putting in variables. So I like doing left to right, bottom to top, width, height. And that way I remember what those actually mean and what those positions are. They're short, I can write them easily, but they're enough information that I know what it means. So the first thing I'm concerned about is just getting that first button on there. So right now, every time I run my code, in order to run this code, I can't just run it here. I would have to run it through my player mode select and then select something, fill out all that stuff. That would get really tedious for testing to run my code. So instead of doing that, I don't need any of this data quite yet. So I'm just going to comment all of that out. And now when I run my code, I'm running it just as it is. And now it's giving me an error because I haven't finished up my idea of my left to right, bottom to top, all of that stuff. Now I'm going to want to make sure to delete this later, because if I leave this here, it's going to clear out the variables that I collected on my other one. This I will leave because when they open this new figure, I do want the player modality box to close first. So I'm going to close that figure and then open the new one. These I need to make sure to delete out. I'm just having these here for the purpose of running this code, troubleshooting it. So again, these are going to be my positions. We'll be playing with where this actually is. I'm trying to think right now where I want my first part of my grid. So the top left side of my grid. So this would be my first part of my grid. My screen isn't square, so then my buttons aren't square. Even though I have the same 15%, keep in mind it's a percent. So 15% of my screen, my width is bigger than my height. So that 15% probably isn't a good idea. I can try to come up with a hard-coded idea of like what would square look like on my screen, but then this is going to change for every screen. So this is another one of those places. If I wanted to look well, there's a little bit of a trick and a rabbit hole to go down to go about this. So I'm going to go it. So right here, I have my screen size. So I already know my ratio of my width to height in this screen size variable. Because here it has my width and my height. So then if I look at this width divided by this height, that gives me a ratio of my height is 1.6 times smaller than my width. Obviously, I don't want to hard code this 1.6 into my code here, because then it would only work for the dimensions of my screen or any screen that has that same ratio. Now that might be a lot of screens, but it's still a better idea just for me to collect this from my variable and then use those to calculate that. And then that's what I can use to alter my width and height here. So let's go ahead and do that. So keep in mind, this is bottom to top. So I'm going to run this right now just so you see where it is. And this is one of the benefits of copy and paste is I don't have to accidentally screw up my variable names. So you see my button goes up kind of off the screen potentially, but definitely up to the top. And The reason that is keep in mind, again, I multiplied, I made this larger, and this is bottom to top. So I'm definitely going off the screen at this time. So here I can hard code a height to get it to fit in. That's probably going to be too low, but so I'm getting this to fit on here now. But the problem is when I go to put my next buttons on, I don't know what that height is right there. Like, so I need to go in and change it. And again, if it's different on different screens, like 0.6 might not be the right call for other screens. So if I'm going to use height to define my bottom to top, I need to define my height before my bottom to top. And there we go. So now it's going to adjust every time based on whatever that height is, and it's going to leave 10% of the screen at the top all the time. Okay, so here's the time I don't want to use copy paste. So I could take this whole thing, copy it, paste it, and do that 9 times for each one of my grid areas, and then have to come up with a different name for all those. And that could be kind of tedious and a little bit frustrating. So instead, as I promised, I'm going to use a for loop. Now I could use a for loop to do all 9 and just go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. But the problem is I'm not just going across, I'm going 3 across, and then I'm going down and I'm going across there. So then I go down and then I go across there. So every time I want to be creating a button in each one of those 9 positions. So since I have more of a matrix and then an array or a vector, then I want to actually use 2 for loops, and then that way I'm shifting over and down. For the placement of down and across, the reason I'm choosing to have a down comma across is because so across is going to count 1, 2, 3, down will count 1, 2, 3. So when I'm looking at the row and the column, I'm going to be thinking about down as my row and across as my column. So my width and my heights aren't going to change, just my left to right position and my bottom to top position. And this 0.05 I'm putting here just as like a little bit of a gap. I might or might not want that gap, but we can see what it looks like. So I'd probably make it pretty small. But keep in mind the gap is going to be different on the left to right and bottom to top. So I'm going to multiply it again by that same ratio that I used before. Now those spaces don't matter, but sometimes I just like to adjust my spacing just for the purpose of looking at it and seeing it. I add spaces, remove spaces, but that's not doing anything to my code. So I still had my previous variable grid, so it didn't like the fact that I was trying to add braces on after the fact. I need to have it begin with that way. All right, so this looks crazy, not what I'm wanting. So I need to go through and figure out, okay, why did I set up my how did I set up my for loop wrong? Well, for one, the left to right, I want to be doing after because I want all 3 to show up on that first one. Bottom to top, I also want to be after because I'm not changing it until after I've already put that first one there. Still going to have a similar problem, but can at least see a little bit closer. And forgot to put my H here. And this is still going to have another error, but I'm at least going to be closer. So you'll notice it keeps starting in the next place. So I need to reset left to right every time at the beginning of the for loop. Back to that original. And I probably don't want to assign it there. That way I don't go try to change it and then only change one of those variables and it doesn't work and I don't know why it didn't change right. So now I have my grid and that gap is pretty big. So I'm going to make it a lot smaller and see what that looks like. There we go. So I have all my buttons for my grid for Tic Tac Toe. And again, I only had to write uicontrol once because I used that for loop to go through and get all 9 buttons on my screen. Now, right now, they don't do anything because I don't have a callback on them, but I at least have my buttons there, which is a start. Again, spacing and doing things like Control A, Control I isn't going to affect the code, but it does change how easy it is to read or not. So I like to do that for readability purposes. So I can't assign my callback function right here because then I don't have all of the data from those buttons going into the callback function. So for the first button, I'm going to pull up the screen. So for this first button, if I were to assign the callback function inside of the for loop, then grid would only be defined as this one button. It wouldn't have all of the information already embedded into it when I'm sending that data to the callback function. So it's important that I put the callback function after I've already assigned all of these positions, all of these different parts of the buttons to that full grid variable. And I can just copy this same for loop. So I'm not doing anything with changing heights, and all of that is now out. What I'm doing here is just assigning the callback. In the previous video, I was always doing the period and then whatever it was that I wanted to change, like this. Here, I'm going to show you another way of approaching this. So anytime I do that period to pick a particular property of a UI control, I can also use instead the get and set functions. So set is to assign something to that property. So I'm saying what my UI control is, and then I'm telling it which property I want to change, and then I'm assigning it whatever value. And I do want my grid variable to go into that. I'm going to run it. It's going to have an error because I don't have player grid defined, but I have all those buttons and I have my callback. So don't forget the first two is that objects and events. I am not going to use either of those right now. So actually I will use object, but I'm not going to use the event. So I'm just going to do that, and so remember object will be the button I pressed. I don't have user data defined yet, so I do want to define user data. So I'm going to have a few different data points that I need. So also, if we remember right, 1, 2, 3 is to continue our code on the next line. That way I don't have to keep going across the screen like that. So I'm going to want to keep track of if somebody selected it, who selected it. So that's something I could keep track here in grid, or I could have another variable to keep track of all that. I'm just going to keep track of it here. And my position, remember, will be changing every time. So my left to right and bottom to top will change every time. So that's something I can use as identifying information to figure out which button they pressed. I'm changing it from nobody to not selected yet because I'm thinking about my user. So remember, as I said, we always want to be thinking about our user. And it's unlikely, but somebody might put as their name nobody. And most likely nobody's going to put for their name not selected yet. So that's why I just changed it to that. So just to show you that all that data is passing, we're going to run it, click one of the buttons, pull this off to the side, and then we see here. So keep in mind, this is all from my for loop, so ignore that. This is my position of the button selected. So remember, this was the one that's in that far left first one. And then not selected yet because nobody selected it yet, so I don't have a user assigned to that. Also, we can see here grid. It has a UI control in each one of these cells. I would have to open the cell to see more details of what's in there. So I can use this bottom to top, left to right, this whole position here every time I'm running it for the buttons, but then I have to figure out how to translate that into the row and column. So it's not too difficult, but there might be other data that I can change inside of the button. So it's always worth looking and seeing like, okay, does any other piece of data make sense? Now it does say value, but value is actually changing based on if I click it or not. So value is the number of times that I've clicked it if it's updating. I do have string, so I could put in the string what position I'm at. But part of the problem with that is, remember, the string actually displays on the button. So that's something visible to the user versus user data. That's a place that's not visible to the user. So my options at this point would be to put in my user data my positioning, like that row, comma, column, or down, comma, across. instead of not selected yet, and then having another UI control that keeps track of all the different places the players played. So I could have some other type of grid that's not called grid, because otherwise I would have that variable overwriting, but another way of storing that whole grid of data of like, has my user gone? Where did they go? Which position? I think I would prefer to approach it that way versus adding in the math to calculate every time what's the row and column number. But that means I need to have that other variable created, and I need to send it here. So again, this is to track the grid play or whatever. Let's call it track played. Obviously, I don't have that variable created yet, so I have to actually create the variable. Now, if I decide to put that above this button or after the button, doesn't matter, as long as I put it before this callback, because obviously I can't send in data for a button or a UI control that's not yet created. I could put it here too, but I don't want to put it here just because this is in the middle of something that's already happening. So it's always a good idea to keep those things separate. As far as the style, it doesn't really matter. I use text anytime I'm storing data, and I always make sure to say visible off because I don't want this actually visible. This is just going to be some hidden thing. And you may have noticed that sometimes I'm good about capitalizing when I'm calling the properties and sometimes I'm not. It typically doesn't matter, but you might come into a couple different properties that it does matter and you really need to be careful about being case sensitive. It's a good habit to always be case sensitive, but I'm not following that good habit. So it's obviously not the end of the world if you don't follow every good coding practice, but ideally you should get in the habit of following those if you're new or even if you're not. I'll follow it sometimes, but if I don't, I'm just letting you know, most of the time it won't matter when you're working with these UI controls if you're having this capitalized or not for those different properties. So the zeros function is just creating a matrix of all zeros. And then what I'm planning to do with that is I'm going to store a 1 whenever player 1 goes there and a 2 whenever the computer plays there. Or I could do a -1 for the computer, whatever it is, as long as it's consistent. I'll probably go with 0, 1. Actually, I might go with -1 just for the purpose of what I'm thinking about when it comes to checking to see if there's a winner if you get 3 in a row. So 0, 1, -1 is what I'm planning on. 0 means nobody went there. 1, player 1 went. -1, player 2 went, or the computer, which is player 2. So remember, I added it here in the callback. I did not add it into the function yet, so that's important that I add it here. So again, this is going to give me my row, comma, column, and this is going to give me the board of plays. And this I don't really need. That I don't really need there either. And it's always good to suppress things when we're done with them, or at least not really need to look at the data now. So I will suppress all that. I'm not using grid yet, but I will use grid. So it's yellow because I'm not using it yet. So that's a lot easier. 2, 2, it tells me exactly where it is in the grid. That way, if I want to slice out from grid, change it in grid, then I already have that happening. So one really important thing that I see people do sometimes in here is like, I just created this variable board. Now, let's say I update board to say that player 1 or player 2 went here. Then it's not actually going to update anything with the track played because I'm not changing track played. So I can play with board here, I can change board here, but it's very important that I remember to update track played with this variable board. I could also just say track played.userData, and then every time in here, change it on that. That way I don't have to worry about using board to update track played. But since I know that and I'm thinking about it right now, the best thing for me to do is say, okay, this is going to equal board at the end of this. Position, I'm just going to be using inside of here if I want to slice out of grid. So this, I don't really have to go about it this way. I could just change it with the object, but I prefer to be changing it in here. It's a preference. And also then I feel more confident and sure of like, okay, I'm changing it in grid. I'm updating the grid variable. That's the one I want to keep working with. I prefer to work with those instead of working with these defaults from MATLAB, but I like using these default transitioning variables just for the purpose of like tracking what did I click, what happened. It's easy to grab the information from there and then change everything in my variables. Again, this is a personal preference. So if you do it differently, I'm not saying you're doing it wrong. Or if you decide to start doing it differently, again, I'm not saying you're doing it wrong. Like if you get your code to work and it is doing what you want it to do, then okay. There are bad coding practices for sure. I wouldn't say that this is one of them, but I would say that this is, again, a coding practice that I prefer when it comes to making graphical user interfaces. So you'll see here, again, it says, I suppressed it, but it selected the position and then it went into grid and it sliced out that particular one in grid. No, it did not because I didn't put braces. So if you have questions about slicing with braces versus parentheses, I have other videos related to that as well. But it's just important to remember if you're slicing out of a cell, braces. So here is my push button I selected. Good. And if you're not sure if it worked, here's an easy check. I can unsuppress that, so that's saying the row and the column. And then here I can say, so this will be the same as this in my command window. So this is going to be row 2, column 3. So I'm clicking that button, row 2, column 3. So keep in mind, I have this uicontrol on here still, so that's not the one that I'm looking at. So ignore this bottom part. But what's concerning me is this 3.2 and then 3.1. So those should both be 3.2. Okay, so if you look at what just happened, because I have this in the way I'm testing this. So because I have this one right here in a vector, it's not saying it as 3.2. It's taking it as a different kind of position versus this one, because we can look at my position here, is different from my position here. So when I say 3.2, then it's giving me the one I want. So what that means is I need to be slicing these positions out differently. So then position, the first one, comma, position, the second one. Now if I run it, they will actually work. So this is going to be 3.1, 3.1, 3.1. So again, this is a reason to do all these different tests because I made the assumption at first, like, oh, it'll be fine. And then when I tested it just to verify, then I looked at it and I was like, that's not okay. So I had to go back and figure out why it wasn't working. And I didn't go super far in the code. I did it right away. And it's super annoying if you go really far into your coding and you're doing all this stuff and all of a sudden you're like, I have no idea why this isn't working. I have no idea why I'm seeing an X on the top right position, but the player clicked on the bottom left position, or, like I would have started seeing that happen. But because I checked, I checked because I wanted to demonstrate to you how to check, but it turned out I really needed to check because it wasn't doing it correctly. It wasn't doing what I thought I was going to be doing. So now that I have the check in place, I can get rid of this. I don't need to check it again. I just checked it. I'm good with it. It is actually working. I have verified it works. Okay, so now I still have this aspect of player 1 and player 2, and then figuring out who played, where they played, and saying that they played. It's a lot of information. So if you remember, I said I was going to randomize who gets to go first. So that's something I would add in here as well. The first thing I'm going to do is just actually create my player 1 and my player 2 as a UI control. So remember, I have player 1 and player 2 name coming in as an input. I also have player mode, but I'm not touching that quite yet. So just like I have CLC and clear for testing purposes, I'm going to assign these values for testing purposes. So that's the same type of data that I'm going to be receiving in. And so that way, when I'm working through this code, I'm working with these pieces of information. So the same one that I've already made, this is important. This UI control that I put here, just that's a hidden one, so visible off, so nobody can see it. I'm going to do the same one for player 1 and player 2. I do not want to put those before my figure, because if I do that, there is no figure there yet. So it's just going to create a figure with these hidden values, and it's not going to be on this main figure. I need to make sure to put these after I created a figure. And now I'm looking at it and I'm realizing that width to height ratio, that was part of this down here. So I want to put that with the rest of that code that it's relevant to. And then I'm going to put my hidden UI controls up here. I typically like to do my hidden UI controls first because there's no callback functionality to them. So if I'm passing that data, I don't have to worry about where that's going or where they are, like, did I pass it and then assign it later or change it later? I'm just getting all of my hidden stuff put into the place first. So figure, all my hidden variables, and then my actual buttons and like different types of things that my user is interacting with. I know my username is going to be a string, so I'm just going to use that. The reason I'm using that to store this information is because I might want user data for something else later. And I already know this isn't a visible thing, so I'm not worried about any of that, but I do want that somewhere within this button. So I'm keeping user data free, so I have it available for later. Okay, so one other thing we can start to see, hopefully, is that right now I'm starting to create a lot of different variables. So I have all these variables that are getting created, and I have to pass all of them into my callback function, my function played, and other functions that I'm going to be creating. That's going to be a lot of data to pass. So at this point, I want to introduce another way of storing data called structures. Now, if you haven't used structures before, I recommend looking into them a little bit, but I'm just going to give you more of the application side of it. So I can create a variable. I'm going to call this variable data because it is going to be mostly all data that I'm storing in this variable. Now I put data dot in front of all three of these variables. Now all three of those variables are stored within that same variable data. So I'm going to show you that real quick by just running this part of my code. So I'm going to clear everything out. Close all. Ignore whatever error came up. Unrecognized. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, that one I can't just ignore. So if we look over here in my workspace, I have data right here is a structure. And then if you look at my other variables, I don't have player one or tracked or anything in this workspace because in data, I have those three variables stored in that data variable. So structures is a way to store multiple variables within one variable. So then the cool thing is I only have to pass data, and now that variable carries all three of these variables. So I don't have to write all three of those as other input arguments to my function. I do, however, have to go change where I had track played and change it to data. And then here, it's just data.trackPlayed.userData. I'm going to test that real quick. I can also use the get and set and all of that. So it doesn't matter what I click. So as we see, it is calling UserData from trackPlayed, which is a variable inside of the data variable, which is a structure. So it carries multiple variables. Hopefully you're following me on that one. If you have questions about it, please be sure to comment, let me know, and I'll give you feedback and explain it more. Whew, so fun, that's exciting. Again, I said that this person is going to be -1. No, this one will be 1. And this person will be -1. So this is, again, what I'll be putting on the board to represent which player has moved. So I also need some text that says, welcome to Tic Tac Toe. I need like a lot of other text and things that are going on here. So at this point, I'm going to add a little bit more text. We have some functionality. I'm going to get into the gameplay, but first I'm going to add some more text to say like, welcome to the game, Tic Tac Toe, whatever it is I want to put, and then also whose turn it is. First, I want to look at my board again, just so I can remember where's all my spacing, what do things look like. So I have pretty much equal space on my left and my right side. I could put originally I said I'd put high scores over here, but with this, I could put high scores over here and then over here, all the current gameplay stuff. So this would have maybe data of the current gameplay, like if they're going to play again, I might just have it automatically start a new board after, like I might put a time delay and just start a new board after a few seconds of who won, or I might have them verify, like start a new game. I'll have to figure that out when I get to that point, but I could put all of that kind of content on the left and then like historical data, high scores on the right. So I think I'm going to go forward with that approach of all of the ongoing gameplay on the left. So again, these are variables related to data that I'm changing for the gameplay. This one will be visible on, so I don't want to make this visible off because obviously I want to display to my user Tic Tac Toe. Again, remember, sometimes it might be easier just to copy and paste things because it is a lot of long text to call every one of those properties every time and then to assign what it is. Or you can just type it. That's, again, a preference. So I'm going to go down here and reference. I have my bottom to top. So remember, I left that 10% gap on the top. So then I want this to fall in that 10% gap. And it is easy to switch up the left to right, bottom to top, even if you've done this a lot. So that's another reason, again, for those variables that I named them the LTR, L2R, and the B2T. That way I can remember left to right, bottom to top. Because as you see here, at first I put bottom to top and then left to right. And then I realized like, oops, I was doing that wrong because then the width and the height is next. So I fixed it. And it's starting to get long again, so I'm dropping it down. So every time we create a new UI control, it's a good idea just to run it, to look at it, to see what it looks like and make sure that you like it. Same thing we did before. I'm going to make this my background color. And so I'm going to have background color equal that value. Oops. So color is the property inside of a figure, but in here it's called background color. So I should probably change this variable. Not that it'll affect anything, but just a good habit. So now I'm seeing it here. And I did see before that I had a little bit of extra space for my font size. So I'm going to kick that up some. But then we can see Tic Tac Toe really well. So I like that better. So then here it's going to say whose turn it is. So I want to display the name underneath, and that will be changing. So this isn't just something I'm hard coding in to be set. Also, I don't like that Tic Tac Toe is kind of off-centered because this is shifted a little further over to the right, which I like the extra space on the left. So I'm going to shift Tic Tac Toe over just a little bit. I could get really particular about being perfectly centered by basing it on the middle button position, like the halfway point of that middle button position. But instead, I'm just going to kind of shift it manually. And that there is close enough for me. I'm happy with it. I'm going to leave it alone. I don't feel like doing all the extra hassle of like doing the math to figure it out or having to change it after I've done the math to figure it out. And I'm just going to leave it alone. So this is going to be either player 1 or player 2. Remember, I said I was going to make it randomized, so I can just do that right here. So this will generate numbers 0 or 1, and then I can just do an if statement based on that. Or another way I can do that is making a vector, slicing it out from the vector. I'm just going to do an if statement. It's one way to keep it simple. The other way is also simple. It's just a different approach. So I like having my variable names fairly similar. That way, if I want to make a small change like player 1 to player 2, I just swap out 1 and 2. So again, the names and the setup of the variable are pretty much the same. I'm just changing that one value so it's easy to transition between the two, and I can copy and paste more. So keep in mind this says visible off, so I need to get rid of that. Also, I need to actually put it somewhere. So I need to add the position. And then I also want to change the background color like I did before. I want probably the same font size and all of that. Now, right now, the position would just be right on top of your next, but I don't want it to say your turn and then on top of it, their name. I want it to be right underneath. So I'm going to drop it down the same amount of that height. So I have hard coded some things in here, like I didn't use those left to right, bottom, top, all those different variable names on these parts. These I'm not as likely to change. I may change them later, but it's a small amount of text, so I don't really mind doing it this way. But again, know that you always have that option of creating everything based on a variable and just subtracting from there, adding from there, whatever it looks like. And that is a better practice, I would say, because then again, you're not hard coding information and it's easier to change it. So you have a more modifiable code. So if you notice when I'm running this here, it's not even displaying. So I don't have it set as visible off. But I did set it as visible off initially. Okay, so maybe you've already figured out before me why it's not showing up, but the position here is exactly what I want it to be for units normalized, but I forgot to update that inside of here. So as you can see, the adventure that you get to go on with graphical user interfaces is going to be probably a lot of errors. If you don't get errors when making a GUI, either your GUI is like super easy or you're super amazing or a little bit of both, you will be having problems like this come about. Not all the time. Hopefully you won't get too many, but just know like there is sometimes frustrations that come along the way. And it does take just that dedication, commitment, and like keep going and just try to think outside of the box as best you can. Try to like have your check marks of like, well, what could it be? So again, it wasn't showing up. I didn't even see like a text box showing anywhere on my screen. So I was trying to think, okay, why am I not seeing anything? And then at one point I thought maybe I saw a dot, and then I brushed my screen off and it was just dust on my screen. But I was trying to think, okay, based on the position was good. And then going through, and then finally I was like, wait a minute, my position is in normalized units. And then what is my actual UI control in? And then looking at it, it's like, okay, it's in pixels. Sometimes what can also be helpful is like if you pull up that list of properties and just read through the list of properties. So if you're really stuck and you can't figure out why your button's not working or why your text isn't working, you can start over, just delete it and start from scratch. Sometimes that helps just to get a fresh perspective and hopefully you don't make the same mistake. Or you can pull up that list of all the properties and read through the properties. So if I would have done that, that would have been my next step if I didn't figure it out. But when I would read through a list of properties, I would have seen units, pixels, and then right there I would know that's the problem. And then I would be able to fix it. And now it's a new problem. So my units, oh, I don't think the order should matter on this, but just in case, let's see if that makes a difference. Yes, it does. So my units did matter. And so I have a really long amount of text here. It goes on to 2 lines. The person's name could go on to 2 lines. So I might want to have that as well. So I might want to keep that in mind as well. So I'm going to make this down to 0.1, which means I need to change my place for bottom to top. So now if they go on to 2 lines, it will fit. And I can see your turn, whose turn it is clearly. So both of them so far has been player 2. So let's run again. Now it's person 1. So I'm running it a second time to make sure, or well, a third time to make sure that it's actually working. Like my randomization of who's going first is working. So I have something that is defining whose turn it is now. So that's great. Still a lot more to do with this, but now when that first button is clicked, I know that it is going to be this person. And when they click that button, I'm going to have to update it to be the next person. So I could use the person's name to keep track of which person it is, or I've already decided this like value 1, -1 is something that I'm using to assign to players to think about where they are on the board. So it'd probably be a good idea for me to be consistent with that and use it here as well. For me personally, I always prefer to have numeric data to work with in a lot of places versus everything being strings and having to do string comparison, go through all the different string functions and having more problems of me typoing. And really that's the big part of it is like, I want to avoid as much as I can a place where I'm going to typo and accidentally put an extra space or something stupid so it doesn't compare them. And then I have to troubleshoot all of that. So based on experience of seeing my own errors, seeing other people's errors, sometimes I try to mitigate those by avoiding, and not necessarily avoiding, but just creating different paths. So paths that are probably more accessible and less likely to lead to error. This is a very generic variable I just created. I realized that I didn't think of anything better off the top of my head, so that's what I'm doing. It's probably not ideal to have a variable name like that, but I'm okay with this variable name. So I'm not going to see anything different here, but again, the value is now going to be -1 or 1 depending on this. And so if I check it here, not num, but value, it says -1, which is aligned with person 2 or computer. Perfect. So then I'm running it again, keep running it until I get person 1, got person 1. And I'm going to check the same thing and it says 1. So it's good. I know that value is working as well as that who's up. So now I can use this value to check whose turn it was and then just assign that onto the board. And first we're going to do that because we're right there and that's a pretty easy change. So let's jump down and do that. And so the good news is we already know from experience that position we don't want to reference inside a board just that position. We would want to reference it this way. So I'm going to follow that same method here. So I'm creating board, updating board, using board to update track play. If you don't know where I'm going, try to figure out where I'm going. But let's run it and then look in the command window. So we see it's a clear board, nothing's happened. And then my first player went here. I'm not changing the player yet, so everything's gonna be negative. That's not what I'm talking about. We will do that next. So then here I've now gone there. If you look, every single time my board is all zeros. And I said it was important that I update my track played with the board, which I do here. But remember, I made track played a structure, or I made data a structure and track played a variable within data. And I don't have that here, so it wasn't referencing the correct variable. So now when I add in new positions, it's updating and it's staying. So I know that my data is working correctly. So again, I think it's a good idea to leave things unsuppressed for the first couple of times you run it. That way you can watch what's happening in the command window. You could also be looking in your workspace, but with UI controls, you look in the workspace and it's mostly just all like, okay, it's a figure, it's a structure, it's a UI control. You can't see information readily available in the workspace, so I prefer to just look in the command window. I think it makes it easier. I don't want to have to dig into that. Every one of these workspace variables, like every time I want to look at it, like double click on it, pull into it, and then say double click on user data. What is that? I've already closed the figure, so it doesn't exist anymore. That's, to me, a very annoying way to troubleshoot. I think looking at your workspace to troubleshoot other types of code is a great idea. But for GUIs especially, I think really sticking to looking in your command window is the best approach. At least for me, that's the fastest approach. And it's super informative. All right. So we have a lot of steps ahead of us. But first, let's just go ahead and deal with player 1 or player 2 are going first, and then it switches. So every time I'm switching to the other person. So I could do an if statement here to go through and say, like, if it's 1, make it -1. If it's -1, make it 1. Or I can do this a lot easier by just saying negative of whatever it is. So if it's negative, it becomes positive. And if it's positive, it becomes negative. So then it will switch it positive, negative the whole time, 1, -1, which is another reason it turns out it was great that I picked 1 and -1. And it is very important that I do that after I update the board, because I don't want to change the board to the opposite of who picked. I want to make sure to change it after, so then it would say player 1 or player 2. The other thing I need to do is I actually need to change it to say player 1 or player 2. Okay, so the cool thing is the string is the current person's name. So that's who's up, right? And then the person who's next, I don't have that name stored anywhere right now. But I'm not using user data in this yet. So let me make sure. Yes, so I'm not using user data yet. So I can use user data here to store the other person's name. And then I can just keep swapping them back and forth. So up here in my if statement, I can say other player equals the opposite person. So in order to do that, I need to collect this information. So I'm saying, okay, who is the current player? That's going to be in the string. And then who's the person that's up next would be in the user data. So then this I'll update here and say, so the string then becomes the person who was next, and my user data becomes the person who was current. You could also do an if statement here, so I could check and see like based on the value, I could check and see based on the name, I could change it that way. But again, this is just a logic approach that I like. So that's something that I'm seeing is like, oh, like this is a pretty easy way to code it. Like if I just keep those two pieces of information always stored in this variable, I'm only having to change this variable. I'm just looking at this variable. I don't have to create an if statement. I don't have to like recall it somewhere else. I don't have to store that information in yet another UI control. I have both usernames in that same UI control all the time. So it's always who's up and who's next, or who was just up. Same thing because I only have 2 players. All right, so let's check our functionality because we've made some changes now. So it says person 1, I click, and then it says person 2. So that's good. So I'm seeing that update. So I'm going to go ahead and yes, this is updating every time. Great. I'm going to suppress all of these. No, not that one. I'm going to suppress all of these because that's working. So what I want to check now is making sure that the board is working too. So I see -1, and then I see 1 show up here. -1 for person. Yeah, so that was person 2 just went, and then person 1's going to go, and then that shows up as a 1. Perfect. All right, so we still have a lot left. We have a lot left in our GUI, and we have, again, that whole gameplay aspect of checking to see if somebody won. Again, I have set it up in a way that I have all -1s and 1s, which makes it really easy because I can just sum up my rows, columns, and diagonals and look for -3 or 3. 3 triggers player 1, 1, -3 triggers player 2, 1. So that's the reason I did that 1, -1 approach in the beginning. And yes, it has benefited me in other ways to make other things easy as well, such as just doing the negative of the original value. It helps having experience because I've had experience with similar games. I haven't ever coded Tic Tac Toe, but I've done other similar things where I'm tracking users, and I have gone through the entire code doing 0, 1, and 2. And I remember from previous experience that there wasn't an easy way just to sum up. That's why I did the 1, -1. I recommend trying to think of things like that ahead of time, but a lot of that comes with experience, either your own experience or watching things like this and you hear from others their experience. So trying to plan ahead of like, what is your future step, just like chess, always be thinking ahead of like, what are you doing in the future? And then focus on the here and now. How are you going to make that happen? But plan. Let's go through a breakdown of like what we have left right now and where my next steps could be. So right now, if I click on this button, I can keep just overriding the previous person. Now, I know some people who like to say like, well, I'm going to make that part of my gameplay is like you can counteract and attack and take that position. Then literally this could be the entire game. If I wanted to leave it that way, fine, that's up to you. I'm definitely not going to do that. So one of my first steps with my buttons is to make sure to enable them off when the player selects them. Also, I need to be displaying to my user who went there. Okay, so right now I could just use their name and display that as the text. So it says who went there and it says their name on everything. I could do like X's and O's. I know I talked about eventually I might want to do like figures and different pictures or users or something like that. So right now at a minimum, I just want to at least have that enable off and like the text there and then play around with it more later. But I just want to at least have something there for functionality purposes and for visual purposes of what that part looks like. So remember, string is where I'm storing who's going right now, who just went, and the user data is that other person. So I want to make sure I'm displaying the correct string here. Again, these are two different ways of approaching updating your variables. You can use that dot version that I have in line 79, or we could use the get and set would be the one to assign or update a value. So I'm using set here. So I'll try to keep showing both of these throughout when I'm collecting values or when I'm assigning and updating values, just so you can see both approaches. And I would say use the one that makes the more sense to you. So if this like dot, when you're having data track player user data, if that starts to get confusing to you, then I would say definitely use the get and set approach. If you don't like calling functions because then the commas in between and putting the parentheses in the right place is more likely where you're going to screw up, then I would say use the dot approach. And as always, explore with both options. If you're not sure, like if you don't sit here and watch it and think like, I have a strong opinion, I'm definitely doing this approach, then I would say try both and see what you do better with. Me personally, I think I lean more towards the dot version, but I do like using get and set in some cases. So for me personally, I probably do use both a decent amount instead of just using one or the other, which is also an option too. You can use both depending on the application. So I see them going enabled off. I don't see the string showing up. So I need to make sure I did that correctly. So I used the wrong variable for my string. And so that's why it showed up empty. But that's why I did this, to unsuppress it, check and see what did it look like. So again, always knowing how to check your work is really important and helpful. Okay, so now I can fill in the whole board, and I don't know if I did not get any wins here the way that I set it in there, but it wouldn't really matter either way because I haven't done anything with the gameplay yet. Also, one other note to think about is keep in mind right now, this is only working for player versus player because I'm not doing anything with the computer like choosing a button and going about a pick. So right now, this is only working player versus player. And again, it's not fully working because I haven't done the whole aspects of like who won, what happened, update with the game. So I have a lot more steps here. So I can make a decision of like, what do I want to focus on first? Do I want to figure out deciding if somebody won and creating a function for that? Or you don't have to put it in a function. I will probably put it in a function, creating a function to see who won. Or do I want to go about thinking about bringing that computer implemented in? And then they're not going to be clicking buttons. So how do I assign that? How do I update that? And where does that happen? So I'm going to start first with the Tic Tac Toe 3 in a row, because again, we already talked about it. I just have to sum the rows, columns, and diagonals to check and see if there's any when that happens. So first is going to be my return variables here. So I'm going to have if there is a win, and then who the winner is. And the whole purpose of this is to check a winner. And for the input, I'm going to need that board. I could call it something else here. It wouldn't really matter as long as I'm consistent about where I'm calling it and how I'm calling it inside this function. I just like board, so I'm going to use that. So I'm just doing a check here just to make sure I'm remembering correctly. So summing, just the normal sum function sums down all of the columns, and comma 2 sums across all the rows, which is what I was thinking it was, but I wanted to check and make sure. I don't have to do checks like that. I can just assume that I'm right, or I can go Google it or whatever it is I want to do. But I like doing checks like this because, again, I don't want to have to deal with the troubleshooting of sitting here and thinking like, what's going wrong? Why isn't this working? Why isn't it adding up right? Why isn't this doing this? Blah, 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 blah. I would rather just have it ahead of time, take the extra like 10 seconds, 20 seconds, whatever it is, to check and make sure that my understanding is correct and I'm doing it correct and I know what I'm doing. I'm just going to add across the diagonals because it's not that difficult and I don't want to spend forever thinking of like different logic. This is the first thing that comes to mind. and I'm not looking to have the most expert way of doing the diagonals. I'm just gonna, it takes 2 lines of code, it's not a big deal. First row, third column, second row, second column, third row, first column. So then that'll be the diagonal this way versus this one's the diagonal. Well, because my hand signal might not be right. This is the diagonal that I did for diagonal 1, and then this is the diagonal I'm doing diagonal 2. Again, those other sums go all across the rows and all down the columns. So if I have a 3 or a -3 showing up in any of these, then I know somebody won. So I have this long nested if statement. It doesn't have to be a nested if statement this way. I've just decided to code it this way. And because I have, then I'm saying, all right, there's a winner, yes. And it automatically is just going to say, yes, there's a winner. But then if all of this becomes true, then it's saying, no, there's not a winner. So it just updates it, changes it. And then at this point, if this is still a yes, an important point I just missed is I need to take the absolute value here of my sum to check for 3 or -3. Or I would have to do the absolute value somewhere else, or I'd have to check for 3 or -3. So if I take the absolute value here, I don't have the winner of like the negative or the positive winner at this point. I would have to re-look at all of these. So I'm not liking this approach right now. So I'm actually going to change it and say, no, I'm not going to do the if statement approach like this. And I don't think I'm going to use this either. So I'm going to comment it out right now. Okay. Again, not doing the absolute value. So when we did the sum of the rows, it is in a vertical. So remember I looked here and then it was sum 4, 2. I have a vertical vector, so a 1/3 versus the sum of the board. This way is a horizontal vector versus this one is just a scalar. And same for this one. So this one I'm also going to make horizontal, and I'm going to make everything horizontal. So by putting that apostrophe, I'm transposing that vector. And the reason I'm going to do that is I'm going to say all checks. And I'm just going to make one giant vector augmenting all of these together. So now with all of those augmented together, I can just do one find and look and see if it's a 3 in there or a -3, or if it's just empty. So here I'm putting that as empty. So if it's not empty, then that means that a 3 is somewhere in there, which would mean that player 1, which would mean that player 1 won. So in this case, I'm going to do the opposite up here. So instead of assigning yes, I'm going to assign no. And then that way I don't even have to check if it's a no, because if this isn't true and this isn't true for the -3, then nobody won. I could put else and then put this within the else. It would be the exact same thing. Doesn't really matter. So again, as I said, the winner, everywhere else I've used the 1 and the 0 and the -1, so I'm going to use that same value here. Because keep in mind, I don't have the player's name in here. I could send that in, so I could have that as an input argument of like, who's my current player, because that's going to be the winner. But instead of sending in the current player, I'm just going to say 1 or -1, send it back out. And then this function is almost done because we have to save it. Now it's done. So I will just grab that code, call my function. So after I've updated my board, every time I update the board, then I want to check if there's somebody who won. And then I have to change everything based on that. So then again, remember if, when, yes. So all of this other gameplay here, I mean, this I really want to do every time. Even if somebody won, I probably still want to update that UI control so I have all that information sent out, just in case. So that I want to do still. And then all of this, like current, who's up, all of that, that depends. Do I want the person who won to go first next time, or do I automatically want to say, okay, every time, like if they win, the other person gets to go? I like to kind of just let the person who won go first. So then I'm not going to do this update if they won. So only when there is no winner, making sure that my casing is correct. I have yes, I have no, using string compare I, at least if my casing was different, it wouldn't matter, but my word's correct. That's the important part. So good. That's going to change only if nobody won. I could put this as an else on here and then I wouldn't have to check this again, or I could do an else if on there. I'm just doing as a separate if statement just to make it easier for me to keep track of everything that's like different parts and different jobs. So I'm going to put a check in here, just like checks and balances type stuff. So then this is the 1 or -1. No, that's my board. So then this is my 1 or -1. So this should always be equal to that current value. So then that would mean that the winner be this person. If that's not the case, then we have an issue and it didn't catch a win at another time, but it would mean that the winner was this person. And as I said, sometimes I like to put little error messages into myself of like something went wrong and why did it go wrong? So I have this here. So like if the winner doesn't equal the value of the person who's up, that's what was identified in the check win, then again, it shouldn't be doing that. So I'm telling myself, this happened, why did it happen? And that way it's just like a little warning message to me to go check some logic in my code. Okay, so from here, I want to do a lot of different things. So when somebody wins, it probably isn't like my, so I do need to have a winner assigned no matter what. So then back over here. So again, this should only be happening if there is a winner. So nest that inside here. So now that's nested inside of the, if someone wins, then who the winner is, that'll be fine. Otherwise, it's just going to be an empty value because it's not assigned. It's just empty, but I have to assign it to something. So I assigned it to empty. Still does not like something. String compare on line 99 is spelled wrong. No error message, great sign. That's always a good feeling. So now person 1 won. but it's suppressed, so I didn't see anything happen. I'm going to unsuppress these. Well, this one obviously didn't happen, so that's good. Let's run it again, and then that way we can see it pop up. So then it says here, so I know that the winning function works. All right, so now let's go on the venture of once that winning function happens, let's look here again. Whoops. Well, that works. So now that somebody won, I would want it to start a new game. So I could have it be a timing function of like, okay, I'm going to wait, like I'm going to pop up and say you won and then wait 20 seconds and then just start a new game right away. Or I could have a button here that says start new game. And I like the button option just because the timing option, if I do some type of delay, sometimes that might be frustrating for the user, like what's happening? Why is it just frozen? And they might just close out of my program. So I want them to keep running it. So I'm going to pop up a button that's really obvious and it says start new game. In order to pop that button up, I have to have it. Now, I don't want to create that inside of my function because then it's only going to exist like in that time inside of that function. I want to create that in the beginning, but make it visible off and then turn it visible on when somebody wins. And I'm going to just put it like right here, same kind of positioning of this at the bottom area. So I could put this in data or I could not. I could create another variable that's dealing with just the gameplay, but I did say I was going to be having this as changing data and gameplay. So I'm going to be putting the start button here. Let's call it restart. And as always, I like copy paste. My units are normalized, so I won't have that problem again. I'm going to go a little higher than that, but basically right around that kind of positioning. I do not want this to be the background color because then it would just blend right in. I want it to be more of a green. I'm just going to turn it on for a second just so I can make sure to see it, and then I'll turn it back off. Okay. Kind of what I figured would happen. I don't like that it's not wrapping my text, so I'm going to look at all my properties and see if there's something related to the wrapping text, because I know in the text it wraps like for that style, and then my push button it's not wrapping and dropping that text. Okay, we tried, so we'll just get over it and I'll make my button a different size, and there it is. It says play again, good enough. You could also do making it a picture. So again, there's options, but not wrapping text inside of your button option. If you figure out how to do that, please be sure to comment and tell me. Maybe there's an update in MATLAB. I have the latest version of MATLAB, and based on my searching on the internet, trying a bunch of different things, we don't have an option of actually having that text without doing an additional panel or something else. So it is what it is, but I'm okay with just changing the button size. And now that we know we're happy with where it is, what's going on, now we can actually change it to be visible off. So then when someone wins, the first thing one of the first things I want to do is make this visible on. Again, no functionality to the button yet, but we can see play again pops up when somebody wins. So that's good, that's working, but again, this doesn't have any functionality yet. So let's put some function to that. I'm not going to pass grid in here, but since I'm not passing in grid and that's where my board is and that's what's keeping track of I'm not passing in grid because I'm not changing anything with grid. Grid's just saying the original. So I'm going to pass in the same data that I have to this function. So I'm passing in the grid, which is all my buttons, because all of those need to be back to enable on, and then all the strings need to be reset to nothing. And then data as it is right now, I don't have to change anything, but I do need to be keeping, well, I want to be keeping track of who's winning and how many times they won. So I'm going to add this to my player 1 and player 2, UserData, to keep track of how many times they've won. So to begin the game, they have won 0 times. So then I can just keep adding upon that every time they win. So I have the winner here inside of this function. So instead of updating it inside of the restart game, I'm just going to update it right here. So if this, so remember the winner is going to be the 1 or 0. So then if it's equal to 1, then I know player 1 was my winner. And otherwise it's going to be equal to 2. Sorry, -1. And that means player 2 won. So it's very important here that I don't just say it equals 1 that they've won. I need to make sure I'm updating whatever's there, because if they had already won previously, I want to make sure to say that. So this will add 1 to the win every time they win. And again, adding just like a check in there to make sure that nothing went wrong. So if this goes, then I know something's wrong with my code. So let's just check this now before we go on to the next part of this. So player 1 just won. And right here, I updated that. So let's see. And it is showing something updated with data, but it's not showing me this particular piece of information. So I will do, this is supposed to be user data. So that would have been an error if I didn't catch that. So then it will display the data for that. So let's try this again. So player 2 should have won. The answer is 1 here. So then if we, because we can keep going right now because I haven't done anything to stop this. Oops, that was person 2. Person 1. Yeah, it still works. It's not switching anyway. So I just created a bunch of different ones. So they should have 1, 2, 3, 4. It says 5 because they still have the previous one. So that's why. So it's counting even though I didn't win anything. It's just still from the previous one because nothing reset, which is fine. So yes, it is working, but not how it's supposed to be working. It's just working in the sense of like the code is doing what it is currently coded to do. So now, again, the other thing I'm gonna have to update with data, I can either pass in data or update it here. I have to update my board. So my board right now is changing with the zeros and the -1s and everything, but I want to reset it back to 0. So then I'll just reset the whole board back to zeros anytime somebody wins. So at this point, I've already done all the background work, but my user hasn't seen anything change yet. At this point, when they do win, before they even start anything new, I want all of my buttons to be enabled off because I don't want them to be able to keep clicking and playing. So here, I want to say enable and then make it off for every button. Okay. So now everything enables off. So then I can't click anything else. The only thing I can click now is play game. And then when I hit play game, that's when I want the whole board to reset. And then I want stats to start showing up here of how many wins and how many losses and all that information the first time. So again, I have to acknowledge the fact that there's the object and event. This time I'm really not using the object, that push button. I don't need anything from it. The only thing I need is that grid. So the things I want to change is I want to turn them back on, and I want all of these strings to go back to being empty. And it's always good to go through and check and make sure and say, okay, is there anything else that I changed with grid? So here I see I'm changing it to enable off, and that's where I want to get rid of that. And here I see I'm updating the string. Now later, if I want to change it to an image, I'm going to be updating the C data. So at this point, I don't have like a default image. I might make a default image, but even if I'm putting the player's name information, I'm probably not going to set a default image. So I can go ahead and do C data as empty right now. That's not going to do anything, but it just helps me be prepared for if I set it as images later, then I don't have to worry about going back and saying, okay, make sure to change that image. I've already set it. So when we run it and we go through and we get a winning person this time, so everything is enabled off, I can't click anything, and then I hit here, play again, and it gives me an error. I didn't put C data in apostrophes. So anytime you get an error like this, two major errors that I get is one, I didn't put in an apostrophe, so it's not a string, and it's not reading it as a property, it's reading it as a variable. The other big one is a misspelling. So I will typo something. For me, it's most commonly for visible. For some reason, when I'm writing visible and I just type it out, sometimes I will accidentally swap the B and the L or something like that because I'm typing too fast. Those are my two biggest common errors when I have a problem with my UI control and something related to a property. All right, let's do this again. So they won, we hit play again, and sure enough, we see the buttons pop up again. And then player 2 just won, so it happens again. And we keep going. And I wasn't really paying attention, just clicking. And now I just made it a cats game, which is good because we haven't addressed this yet. So if there's no winner, we haven't addressed what to do. And if you notice, the play again button was there the whole time we were playing, and I only want that to show up when the game is over. So there's a winner or the whole board is filled and nobody won. So let's address those two big issues. Play again, being visible, that's super easy. I can just go to right here. I could type it all out, but I like copy paste. So the first thing I want to do here is just make this off because they only get to click that button one time, disappears, and then it comes back when it's relevant. All right, now the other part, that cats game, because again, so here, click, click, winning, play again, great. So we're playing again, and then, so now I have a cats game. Why is my button still there? So it's not enabling off because I didn't pass that data in. So I need to pass in data, or the other way I can do it is I can use this object now, and I can just say, yeah, now you see cats game, it doesn't appear. So that's the other one we have to address. So play again, click it. Now it's disappearing. And again, it's still coming back up, so that's good. Now I have a cats game, so nobody won, and that play again button's not popping up. So I need to check for when everything has a value, then I need to make sure to say, okay, restart the game, have that play again pop up. But then it won't do any changing of like counting a win, which if you remember, the counting the win is up here anyway in this area, and it's not in that function. So the only thing I'd want to do is this function and then also resetting my actual board, which is what I did here. All right, now we are going to make this an else if statement. And then I'm going to have my last one be And then I'm going to reset everything to zeros, and I'm going to have this button become visible. Turn on. I don't need to set all these as enable off because every button's been clicked. So every button is already enabled off. So that's the reason I'm not copying and pasting that part. But in order for me to have this tie be the other option, I need to go in and actually make if when also have an output of tie. The other way I can do this is, okay, when board is equal to 0, it will come up as a true or false with a logical array. So if I do the sum of the sum, which would be a scalar then, so if all of that is equal to 0, meaning there's no zeros anywhere on the board, that means that every position has been played. Now, obviously, I don't want to do, like, it could be that somebody won on the last move. So I don't want to just say automatically it's a tie. I want to check and make sure that there's no winner. So if when and I could say not winning, so not yes, or I could put string compare to no. That's the same thing. So then again, no positions left to go and there's no winner. So then I want to say, okay, it was a tie game. Now adding that tie in will address that other problem here in this main game. So let's go for it. And so then play again, shows up, and this is a tie. So nothing's happening here. And as we see, I didn't add points to anyone, so everyone's the same. They're both at 0. Nobody had a win yet. Okay, so we have that functionality here. Then the other part that we want to get into is, again, I want to be displaying on the side, like how many wins each person has, the current stats. So the first time like there's actually a win in place, that's probably when I want to display it. I could have it displaying the whole time of like the number of wins and have it say 0 in the beginning and then it increases. You know what, instead of playing with like the visible off and stuff, I'll just have them both displaying the whole time of how many times they've won. So again, keep in mind there's the text that we are changing and the text that we're not changing. So in the case of this figure, I'm going to be having text related to like how many wins player 1 has, how many wins player 2 has. I could do them on top of each other, next to each other, whatever that's going to look like. But that text where it says player 1's wins and player 2's wins isn't going to change. So that's text I could put up at the top area with all that text that's not changing. But the number of wins that's going to be displayed, that will be changing. So the number of wins that I'm displaying, that's what I'm working with right here. So I already have these two variables and I'm not doing anything with them as far as displaying information. And if I think about what's in here, so value I don't want to touch, user data is now my number of wins, and my string is my player name. So the big question would be, do I use that string anywhere? And I don't think I do. But let's check and make sure. So it's not showing that I'm using it anywhere. I will scroll and check visually also. Yeah, I don't use that actually anywhere. So I don't really need to be storing the strings here. I was thinking just in case I was going to use them somewhere, but the reality is like I store both strings in the YourUp function or YourUp UI control. So I don't need them here. So then instead I can have this be where I have my value showing. So this is a way that I'm checking the variables that I have. I'm trying to think of, okay, how can I eliminate having to add another variable when I don't really need to? getting kind of long. So again, dropping down. Make sure I get those normalized units. So then my position here, so this one's gonna be on the left, this one's gonna be to the right. And I'm gonna make these half the width, and then that way they're right there next to each other. And I do want to drop them down a little bit because I want to make sure I have room for that text of like number of wins and probably putting their names there. So I'm going to grab all this just so I don't have to rewrite anything with that, and then come up here. So remember we said we're going to have the text about player 1 and player 2 wins. And both of these are going to be visible on. And then also same for down here. I didn't change these. I do want these on now. Also, another thing I didn't do is anything with my font size, font weight, all that. So let's go ahead and do that too. So then those are now updated. The number I want to be pretty big, the text I'll make smaller than that number. So like even 30, why not? Get crazy. I might need to make this taller depending on what it actually looks like. I might need to make the height bigger, but we'll see when we get there. For right now, I just want to know that I don't care about user data or the value. I don't need that with this. But I do need my string. And so my string is going to be from those variables up here. Plus a little more. So I can just augment those together. And it's kind of awkward, the 3 apostrophes, but I want like apostrophe S. So that's why I did that there. Okay, so we added a lot of text boxes and different things. So let's see where we're at. So this is good. This one is not. So let's go and check our player 1. So here, this should be 0.1. I don't think I have that problem down here. So let's check where we're at now. Okay, so then that's just not enough space. Or what's my width? I changed my height and not my width. Player 2. Really, this is one where I have a lot of different value, really, this is one where I have a lot of different variables that are all dependent on the same height, same width, all of that. So would it make more sense if I didn't hard code it? Yes. And I have a lot of space I could work with to the right. So I could make it a little bit wider and then shift over and then just take up more space. So I'm going to take a little bit more space up. Good enough for me. And so then you see the number of wins. So right now you will see that that's not going to update. It still says 0 because I'm not updating that text yet. So I need to make sure to update the text. So remember, these numbers right here are within the string part, not the user data part. And the user data is where I'm keeping track of the number of wins. So I need to update the string based on the num to string version of that user data. So let's go do that. Okay, so now it says person 2-1, we play again. Person 2-1 again. Person 2 keeps winning because they're going first. So let's let person 1 win. Oops, and I let person 2 win again. Person 1. There we go. So then they have a win. Both of them are working. And then let's do another one just to make sure. So yes, it's adding up. It's working correctly. I'm keeping track of the number of wins. And that's good. So we've made progress. We still have left that we don't have a computer. This is only really working for a PvP version, and I need to figure out PvC. And if I want to have more stats, I could do more stats. Like right here, I could do like a little pie chart that's a constant reminder of how great you are or how much you're sucking, depending on which side you're on. And then I could have like historical high scores, keeping track of time, number of moves, different things like that. A lot of different options over on this other side. I am not going to touch the high scores, other stuff options for a little while. I, for now, will just leave the interface like this over here. My next big focus is going to be making it work for both PvP and PvC and like integrating this all together with that other code. We could integrate it together with the other code right now. I mean, it's not really that big of a difference. I'm just going to comment this out, comment all this back in. If you didn't know, there's like a delete comment button up here to delete all your comments at once. It's very useful, super great to know. So remember, I can't run from here. I have to now run it from here. I still don't have a message box because I really don't like it. So PvP, since that's really my only option, either way, it would honestly just go to the same one anyway. Both players' names are filled in. I hit start. And I didn't put end at the end because I commented the function back in, but I didn't end the whole function. So let's do that. Run it again. Opens this, and then you see names here. Winning. So again, the functionality works the exact same. I just started from the other original landing page of like PvP versus PvC. And then at this point, I will still have to make that decision of how I want all of this to sit in here. The reason these just turned blue is because they just became global variables. I don't need these to be global variables. They shouldn't be referencing the previous version. These are all like new variables. So in order to get rid of the global variables, if I wanted to make sure that I'm keeping track of, okay, wait, I don't cross one. So you'll see now, like I'm not needing to pass that data. MATLAB has decided for me that they think I'm trying to pass across and down and all that information, and I'm not. I'm like, those are just different variables. I just didn't rename them something different because there was no need to. So again, all the passing data I'm doing throughout every single function. Nothing is a global variable here. Everything is being passed. I do have a function within a function, but that is just for the purpose of having an original landing page. If I, as you saw, we like coded this whole thing without that original landing page, so I could just easily comment out the function and comment out the end at the end, and then comment those back in if I want that landing page back. So the functionality is working. I could, if I wanted, make all of what's here just like one version of the game and then have PvC as another version, or I could make it PvP and PvC within this one version and just making some minor changes based on the gameplay part. I'm probably going to do the minor changes based on the gameplay and not copy paste the whole code into another script file and then edit it, because I don't really see the reason of doing that. I will say good habit. I am going to copy this whole code though and paste it into another script file and call it something else. It won't work because it's not calling the function correctly, but I'm going to call it like my backup PVP works. So it's always a good idea when you have working code and you're happy with it and you've made a lot of progress to store it somewhere else, because I know the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to jump in and start changing gameplay. So, or sorry, main game and all the gameplay in it because I want PVC to work. But if I change something and all of a sudden my original functionality is gone and I don't know what I changed and why it happened that way, it's good to have this backup. So good habit to be in. And as I said, we are going to stop here with not running from there. We're going to stop here with the person start, and then with this, because again, it works, it looks good, I'm happy. I don't need to go through and do any more today, but I will be going through the next video. We're going to be talking about how to get that PVC mode working with this GUI.